Chapter 5. Missing. A few hours later, Rebecca stood in line at one of the wells in the yard. The sun beat down on her linen cap, and the back of her dress was damp with sweat. A wooden yoke sat heavily on her shoulders. An empty pail staggered from either side of it. As she waited for her turn to draw water, she looked around the yard, hoping to catch sight of old Johnny. She had not seen him since she'd had to rush out to the woodpile, and she needed to talk with him about the spoons. "Good day, Rebecca," a cheerful voice behind her exclaimed. "'Tis hot as an oven on baking day, isn't it?" Rebecca turned around and saw that 13-year-old Hannah Randolph had joined the line behind her. Hannah's parents were the fort shopkeepers. They kept supplies of flour, molasses, salt, and other necessities in a corner of their cabin and traded with the other settlers. Hannah was a friendly, talkative girl who always knew the latest gossip. Now she fanned herself with one hand and asked Rebecca curiously, "What's the white Indian boy like? Is it true he doesn't talk?" "It's true," Rebecca told her. "Folks have been coming by and asking him questions about friends or kin who've been captured. He says naught to them. Just sits there and whittles." "Ooh," Hannah exclaimed with a shudder. "I don't know how you stand it. I'd hate being in the same house with an Indian, even if he were white. Indians give me the shakes." "If only you knew how much they scare me," Rebecca thought. But all she said was, "Me too." It was now Rebecca's turn to draw water. First she filled one of her buckets, then she began the next. As Rebecca worked, Hannah chattered on. "Miriam Willard was here not long ago. She was telling everybody about the party that the Johnsons are having at their farm Friday night." Rebecca nodded. Miriam was a daughter of the fourth second in command, Lieutenant Moses Willard. She lived with her sister and brother-in-law, Susanna and James Johnson, on the Johnsons' farm just outside the fort. Miriam helped her sister take care of the Johnsons' 3 children, little Susanna, Sylvanus, and Polly. "The Johnsons are inviting everyone to their party," Hannah continued. "I can hardly wait. I haven't danced in ages. You'll be going, won't you?" "I think not," said Rebecca. She hung her filled buckets onto the wooden yoke. The 2 buckets balanced each other, making the heavy load easier to carry. "We have no one to escort us from the fort." "You must come," Hannah urged. "'Twill be merry if many of us dance together. You and Celinda could walk with my family." "Thank you," said Rebecca. She was pleased to be invited, but the mention of Celinda reminded her of how desperately she needed to see old Johnny. "Have you perchance seen the peddler?" "Indeed I have," Hannah reported. "He rode out of the fort about noon. I heard him tell the sentry he'd be back by sunset." Her eyes narrowed curiously. "Have you something to buy? Or sell?" "My mamma's been buying needlework lately." "Is that what you have?" Rebecca knew her friend's fondness for gossip, so she answered vaguely, "Oh, a few odds and ends." Water sloshed from the buckets as she started walking away, carefully balancing the yoke on her shoulders. "Good day, Hannah." Rebecca returned home and busied herself with her chores, trying to stay as far away from Isaac as she could. At mid-afternoon there was a knock on the door. When she opened the door, she was surprised to see Private Chandler. He was carrying a bucket with a chunk of lye soap in it. "Before he left, Captain Stevens told me to take Isaac down to the river today for a washing," the private explained. "It'll be his first step back to living like white folks." The widow cupped her hand over her ear. "Eh?" Private Chandler repeated his message loudly. "Can't he go on his own?" the widow asked. "He's a big boy. He doesn't need you to watch over him." Private Chandler shook his head. "Orders are he's not to leave the fort without a guard. The captain doesn't want him running back to the Indians." "Where would he go?" the widow scoffed. She looked out the window. Fort No. 4 was rimmed by mountains and forests on 3 sides, and by the river on the 4th side. "'Tis a long journey back to where he came from. How would an unarmed boy get there by himself, especially with the first frost not far away?" Private Chandler stood stiffly. "I have my orders, ma'am." The widow sighed. "Very well," she said. She spoke to Isaac and Abenaki and mimicked the action of washing. Isaac gave the widow a long look, as if he wondered whether to agree to her request. Then he silently rose to his feet. "Wait," said the widow. She made her way over to her trunk and pulled out a man's shirt and breeches. "These belong to my Ethan," she told Private Chandler. "Give him to Isaac after he's washed." Private Chandler left with Isaac, and Rebecca was relieved to have the savage boy gone. She washed dishes, tidied the cabin, then set to work pickling the cucumbers. She began by draining away the salty water in which the cucumbers had been soaking. Then she rinsed the cucumbers in fresh water, dried them, and put them in crocks. Next she filled the widow's biggest pot with vinegar and put it over the fire. As the pot heated, the sharp smell of vinegar filled the cabin. Rebecca held her nose as she stirred the herbs into the pot. When the mixture finally came to a boil, she ladled the scalding liquid into the crocks filled with the cucumbers. Then she carried the crocks outside to cool in the shade of the cabin. Now we'll have something to eat with our beans in the winter, she thought with satisfaction. She went back to the well to draw more water for the evening meal. Several other women and girls were already waiting in line with their buckets, so Rebecca had to stand in the hot sun for what seemed like forever. While she waited, she kept an eye out for the peddler, but he did not appear. When she finally returned to Widow Tyler's cabin, Rebecca was surprised to see Ezekiel walking out the front door. He looked nervous, and when he saw Rebecca, he stopped. "Where's that boy?" he asked. "He's not here," Rebecca replied. She noticed that the bruise on Ezekiel's forehead had grown bigger and darker. "You should stay away from him." "Ha," Ezekiel muttered. "I can care for myself." He strode away. Rebecca entered the house. The widow was asleep. Rebecca doubted that she'd even been aware of Ezekiel's visit. What is Ezekiel up to, Rebecca wondered. I hope he leaves us alone. Soon Private Chandler was knocking at the door again. When Rebecca opened it, she saw a young man standing behind the private. For a moment she wondered who the stranger was. Then she realized it was Isaac. Ethan's old clothes fit Isaac as if they had been made for him. His hair, which had been greasy, was now a clean light brown. It was tied back with a strip of leather, and for the first time Rebecca could clearly see Isaac's face. He had green eyes, high cheekbones, and a strong mouth. He's not bad looking, she thought. He might even be handsome, if he ever smiled. Private Chandler grinned. Cleaned up good, didn't he? The widow, awakened by the knock, approached the doorway. Her eyes held a faraway look, and Rebecca wondered whether she was remembering the son who had once worn those clothes. And there's something else, the private continued. On our way back from the river, we took the north route, past your old farm, Rebecca. Do you remember the big elm tree? Rebecca nodded. The Percy's cabin was now a burned ruin surrounded by overgrown fields, but there was still a giant elm in the corner of the yard. It was close to fairyland, and Rebecca and Selina had often played under its branches. We was passing by that tree, and Isaac spied a beehive, Private Chandler said. Well, I tell you, he can climb faster than a squirrel. He shimmied up that tree, and he grabbed this. Private Chandler held out a large piece of honeycomb wrapped in a handkerchief. Didn't get stung or nothing. Guess all the bees had moved somewhere else. Honey, the widow exclaimed. Her eyes shone with happiness. I knew the Lord would provide. Isn't it wonderful, Rebecca? Yes, ma'am, Rebecca said, but she wished Isaac had never set foot on her family's farm, even to get a honeycomb. Widow Tyler gratefully took the honeycomb from Private Chandler and spoke in Abenaki to Isaac. He nodded and came into the house. He sat down on his bed and began whittling as if there were no one else in the room. Soon Celinda came home. She was later than usual, and she looked tired. She brightened when she saw Isaac in his clean new clothes, and she was thrilled by the honeycomb he had found. Then Isaac handed her what he had whittled, a walking stick that fit Celinda perfectly. "'Tis very kind of you," she exclaimed. She took a few steps with the aid of the stick. "It eases my walking greatly." Rebecca was pleased to see both her sister and the widow smiling. Perhaps I've been too hasty in my judgment of Isaac, she thought grudgingly. That night Isaac again had several helpings of supper, with liberal lacings of honey on his cornbread. I wonder if he brought the honey because he wanted to be kind, Rebecca thought as she watched him lick the sticky golden syrup off of his fingers. Or was it only because he wanted something sweet? Isaac glanced up and saw Rebecca watching him. He glared at her, then pulled off the leather strip that tied back his hair. His hair fell forward, shielding his face once again. Then he rose from the table, and without a word returned to his bed, closing the curtains after himself. All he wants to do is sleep, and eat all our food, Rebecca thought resentfully. After supper was over, she washed the dishes, then measured out dried beans to soak for the next day's dinner. She looked at the remaining beans in the barrel, then called to the widow in a voice loud enough for Isaac to hear. Ma'am, we'll run out of bean soup if that boy keeps eating so much. The widow frowned slightly. I suppose we'll have to buy more for Mrs. Randolph. Still, it does my heart good to have a boy in the house again. She rose from her chair. Good night, girls. Sleep well. As the two sisters prepared for bed, Rebecca told her sister about her meeting with old Johnny. I talked to him about our spoons. He seemed interested in buying them. He said he'd have to see him before he offers us a price, but he thought they'd be worth 13, maybe 14 shillings each. So Linda added the sums in her head. Then she looked up at her sister, her forehead creased with worry. That wouldn't be enough money. We'd need 40 shillings in all. We must bargain with him the way that Mama and Papa always did, Rebecca resolved. Papa used to say that no one ever takes the first price they're offered, and we won't either. But what if it's not enough? Celinda asked. What if we're a few shillings short, and Mrs. Cutter says I still must go with them? There must be other things we could sell, Rebecca assured her. Let's look. The girls opened their trunk. By the dim light of the moon through the loft window, they sorted through the truck's musty contents. The only clothes they had were cast-offs from other settlers. For winter, each girl had a heavy shawl, as well as mittens, extra petticoats, and thick woolen underclothes. None of these would sell for much, said Rebecca as she looked through the patched and worn winter clothing. Besides, it'll be cold before long. The trunk also contained a heavy box of iron nails that had been salvaged from their burned cabin and barn. Rebecca and Celinda had kept the nails carefully stored in the hopes that Papa would someday use them to build a new house. We could sell the nails, Rebecca told her sister. Papa could get new ones when he comes back. If he comes back, she thought sadly. Celinda pulled out the woolen quilt she had made from scraps of well-worn out blankets. Perhaps we could sell this. The girls looked at each other. If they sold this quilt, they would have only one wool quilt to keep them warm over the freezing New Hampshire winter. But they would still have each other. Very well, Rebecca agreed. We'll sell the quilt, too, if we must. Rebecca reached for her sister's hand. It was callous and pricked from too many hours of sewing. But perhaps we won't need to. The two sisters went to bed. Rebecca was tired, and soon she was sleeping soundly. In the middle of the night, however, she was awakened again by a sharp cry. No, Celinda called out despairingly. No. Shh. All is well, Rebecca whispered. She was relieved when Celinda did not awaken fully, but instead fell back into a deep sleep. Rebecca lay in the darkness. She tried to get back to sleep herself, but the sleeping loft was hot and she was thirsty. Her tongue felt like sheep's wool, what she wouldn't give for a dipperful of water. She quietly eased herself out of bed, and, careful not to wake Celinda, climbed down the ladder and helped herself to a drink. It was cooler downstairs, and the water felt good on her throat. Standing in the quiet cabin, she listened to the sounds of the night. Mosquitoes whined and flies buzzed aimlessly. The widow coughed, then resumed her raspy breathing. Upstairs, Celinda shifted on the mattress. Everyone's asleep, Rebecca thought. Then she realized that no sounds were coming from behind Isaac's curtains. She listened hard, but there was nothing. Do Indians even sleep quietly, she wondered? Curiosity overcame Rebecca. She tiptoed to the edge of Isaac's curtained space, held her breath, and listened as intently as she could. There was not a single sound. Carefully, she picked up the corner of one of the curtains. By the dim moonlight, she could see the bed. The covers were rumpled. But the savage boy was gone.